against.
Okay, right. Here, I'll just give an introduction. I'm very happy to introduce Professor Christopher Townsend. My name is Marcus Miller. I'm the curator of public dialogue and participation, and I want to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory, homeland of Métis, and I'd like to reaffirm our relationship with one another. Professor Christopher Townsend is currently with the Department of Media Arts at Royal Holloway, University of London. And Dr. Townsend examines the way in which artists corrode the boundaries between media, particularly within the modernisms of the 19th and early 20th centuries. He focuses on how artists use technologies to extend the analysis of art's formal rhetoric, the boundaries of subjective experience, and he thus engages with modernist avant-garde in film, photography, and performance. Dr. Townsend has been a senior research fellow at the Henry Moore Institute, which led to his 2014 collection, Modernism's Intermedialities, From Futurism to Fluxus. This was published at Cambridge Scholars Press, in a volume co-edited with Rhys, Davies, and Alex Trott. His varied body of work includes curated exhibitions as well as formal academic publications, a number of monographs and catalogs. His current interests are multi-directional. What brings Dr. Townsend here to Saskatoon is his project with Professor Anne Martin in the Department of English here at the University of Saskatchewan, with whom he's developing an essay collection and an exhibition on the motor car in modernity. And when I met Dr. Townsend the other day, you know, I asked him what his interest in motor cars was, and he told me, I don't know if you want to get this in public here, he was a racing car driver. Yeah. Fantastic. But you know, the repressed returns, and it's going to return in this exhibition here, and the essays. But you know, he was asking us, and we're a bunch of university types, is there a car culture here in Saskatoon? And we looked up at the ceiling and scratched our heads. We nodded, no, there's no car culture here in Saskatoon. But clearly he was asking the wrong group of people, because there is absolutely a car culture here in Saskatoon. And it was just yesterday morning, I think, that I heard an item on CBC where the Dragons Rod and Custom Car Club, and I'll give you their link, Christopher, are going to be inducted into the Canadian Street Riding Hall of Fame. So I'll turn you on to that, okay? Because we definitely have a car culture here in Saskatoon. The focus of this collection that he's working on now is interwar Britain, the cultural narration of motoring and kinetic modernisms between world wars. This is familiar territory for Dr. Townsend. Since 2016, he and his researchers have been working with the Tate Gallery in London to produce a major digital project focused on Duncan Grant's abstract kinetic collage painting in 1914. And this artist is part of the Bloomsbury Circle surrounding Virginia Woolf, and the digital project on Duncan Grant's scroll is the topic of this talk today.
Thank you very much. So, yeah, what I'm going to do is talk, and I've got a few slides, and then there is a short film which I want to show, which will be going in an edited form, slightly different form on the Tate website when it goes live. The scroll, and I'm also not going to call it the abstract kinetic collage painting because it's like a bit of a mouthful. What we call it is the scroll. And what survives in the Tate is this, which is a very heavy piece of canvas. It's about, do you do centimeters or inches here? Centimeters. Yeah. 28 centimeters wide and about 14 feet long. I can't even remember that. Yeah, it's long. It's added to which it's kind of got all these pieces of paper glued and painted to it, right? And Grant's aspiration was that this would move. Well, it's not going to move anywhere in a hurry, but I'm going to explain maybe our project was to show how Grant might have made it move, in the sense that we regard this very much as an unfinished piece of art, and what we've done is used 1914 technologies and experimented with those to see how it might have then worked out had Grant had the time and perhaps the technical expertise to finish it. Anyway, so in late August 1914, indeed in the week that World War I broke out, the painter Vanessa Bell wrote to her old friend and mentor, the art critic Roger Fry. She offered some comments on her work, and that of her fellow artist and partner, Duncan Grant. Quote, I won't do Vanessa Bell first. Duncan and I do nothing here but paint. He has started on a long painting, which is meant to be rolled up after the manner of those Chinese paintings and seen by degrees. It is purely abstract. Bell was writing from the calm of Asham House between the Sussex towns of Lewes and Newhaven. It was leased by Bell's sister, the novelist Virginia Woolf, and her husband Leonard, and they had sublet the property to Bell and Grant and gone for a walking holiday in northern England and Scotland. So it was at Asham that Grant began the abstract kinetic collage painting, or scroll, though it would be in his studio in Fitzroy Square in London by January 1915, perhaps still being worked on and shown to important figures in British intellectual and artistic life, including the novelists E.M. Forster and D.H. Lawrence. The scroll is an extraordinary work, even though Grant, we think, never actually completed it. To make an abstract painting as a British artist in 1914, a wholly abstract painting, was a pretty radical act. Grant and Bell were amongst a very, very small group of people who were just starting to do this. To conceive of one that might then move, even more radical, and to think of how you might then accompany it with music, as Grant later said it was his intention, is completely out of, it's off the page. So, what we have in the Tate is this raw canvas, 450 centimetres. Here we are, I have it in long and 28 centimetres wide, glued, and it's covered in these clusters of glued paper, which are then painted in gouache or watercolour and ink. And as you will see, depending on whichever way you want to run it, there is kind of a formal evolution or development in the pattern of each cluster as you go across the canvas. So in all, there are 17 of them, each composed of 6 rectangles. And Bell's letter to Fry tells us much about what Grant wanted to do with this canvas. That it was meant to be rolled up and seen only incrementally. Immediately suggests the influence of Chinese scroll paintings, which unwind horizontally and progressively. That Grant and Bell were aware of such art was probably due to the work of Lawrence Binyon at the British Museum. Binyon had published in 1908 the first survey of Oriental art in English, painting in the Far East, and followed it in 1911 with The Flight of the Dragon. The two painters were certainly familiar with those books, and they may have attended some of his lectures. Also, as early as the autumn of 1911, Grant had already experimented with horizontal scrolls. Simon Watney notes that on a tour of French Romanesque churches, accompanied by Fry and Clive Bell, Vanessa's husband, Grant made, quote, several topographical scroll-like drawings which explore the abstract qualities of line and tone as much as the actual landscape before him. I think what's notable here for the subsequent experimentation with abstraction and kinesis is that Grant was already then, by 1911, using the temporal development of space to undertake abstraction from nature. However, the dynamism of the scroll was understood by others as being far more modern in its intent. A letter from D.H. Lawrence, immediately after seeing the work in January 1915, written to Lady Ottoline Morel, associates the work with recent developments in European modernism. Quote, tell him not to make silly experiments in the futuristic line, with bits of colour on moving paper. This does not tell us about the intended direction of movement, though it does tell us that Lawrence had some familiarity with Futurism's desire to replicate in art the speed and noise of modern life, and indeed Lawrence had, by 1914, read some of Marinetti's work. He'd read the Futurist Manifesto of Painting. He was a painter himself, quite kind of traditional, figurative painter, but he understood modern trends, and particularly Futurism, quite well. Grant's companion, the writer David Garnett, who was at the same encounter, left his own account of this meeting with Lawrence, one that suggests that the work had also progressed to some extent with the addition of rollers, and which leaves no doubt about it being displayed horizontally. Finally, Lawrence was not impressed by Grant's painting, if you recall this. Finally, in despair, Duncan brought out a long band of green cotton on 2 rollers. I stood and held one roller vertically and unwound, while standing a couple of yards away, Duncan wound up the other, and a series of supposedly related abstract shapes was displayed before our disgusted visitors. After this, nothing more is heard about the work until it's found in a loft at Charleston by Grant's new amanuensis, Simon Watney, in 1969. At which point, Simon, incidentally, was about 18 at that point. He was a first-year art history student, or second-year art history student at Sussex University. He was an undergrad. However, it probably stayed in Grant's London studio until the outbreak of World War II, when Grant and Bell transferred their work to Charleston to protect it from bombs. And it's at this point that we start to kind of get a history, or kind of statements made about the scroll that come to be accepted as kind of factual, but which are in fact inherently problematic and lead to us misreading it. So I'm going to go through some of those. So after the scroll was acquired by the Tate in 1972, a film was made under Grant's supervision. This made it run horizontally. Tate curator David Brown, who talked extensively with Grant, wrote that he intended that it should be viewed through a rectangular aperture, 61 or 60 centimeters wide, and of the same height as the scroll itself, 28 centimeters, with the painting mounted on 2 spools, moving slowly from left to right by mechanical means. So what we have is effectively that all blanked off in a little viewing window there. Right, good. And we're running it horizontally. The viewing window was supposed to be lit. And it was only in these conversations in and around 1972 that the accompaniment of the scroll by recorded music seems to have emerged. There's no mention of it at all in 1914-15. Grant, shortly after this, told Simon Watney that he had no particular piece in mind, but that music was intended as accompaniment. Grant subsequently told David Brown that he perhaps had Bach in mind, and the film is accompanied by the Adagio from Bach's First Brandenburg Concerto. While Brown's account is useful, we need to treat these kind of detailed recollections made some 60 years after the fact with caution, given that a considerable period of time has passed and this is a work that the artist has wholly neglected for most of that time. Furthermore, the way that the Tate understood and represented the scroll at the time of its acquisition has profoundly affected the way in which we now see it. The work that I've done with Rhys Davies and Alex Trott is a deliberate attempt to redress this framing of it as a proto-filmic artwork. So Rhys is an expert particularly on early recorded sound technologies and the uses and kind of sound in the early 20th century. Alex is an expert on Cubism. The 1974 film regularizes its movement, and, contrary to what Grant says about having it moving past the viewing window, treats it as a projection. Something you see from back there, projected onto a screen. So, you could not immediately, if we have this film, the film was made by effectively laying the whole scroll out and telecine it with the camera. You could not project light, as I'm sure you're aware, through a painted canvas. Nor indeed could you readily, in fact, make this canvas move for reasons which I'll come to. So, by presenting it as a film, the Tate made the work accord with early histories of experimental film, as they were then being reclaimed in influential discourses by the late modernist avant-garde, whether in books such as Malcolm Legrice's Abstract Film and Beyond of 1977, Standish Lauder's The Cubist Cinema of 1975, or major exhibitions such as Film as Film, Formal Experiment in Film 1910 to 75 at the Tate Gallery in 1979. These projects claimed the previously neglected and culturally denigrated medium of film for modernist studies by appraising it in the then dominant formalist terms used to analyse modernist painting, including the privileging of abstraction and the artwork's self-referential attention to its own production. These were, not coincidentally, amongst the dominant framing concerns for the making of experimental film in the 1970s, especially amongst artists associated with structural film. In conforming to the dominant interpretive models of the late modernist avant-garde, the Tate's curators thus neglected important potential relationships for the work beyond the domain of painting. Most notably, its associations with the domestic arts of Bloomsbury, as manifested in Grant and Bell's work for Fry's Omega workshops, and particularly the technical constraints of 1914 technologies and the utopian possibilities of the artist's imagination. So I want to talk a bit about technique, or technical questions raised by Brown, because many of the things that kind of the Tate claimed for the work in the 1970s would have been difficult, if not impossible, to achieve in 1914. For starters, in 1914, the work could not have been accompanied by a Brandenburg concerto. No Brandenburg concerto was recorded until 1921. Extensive searches of catalogues, British recording catalogues from 1914, revealed 2 short pieces by Bach. Neither are orchestral, they're both duos. Grant's ideal length for the film in 1970 is longer than any readily available gramophone disc from 1914. Simply, you couldn't get that much, you couldn't get 3 minutes and 45 seconds onto a disc in 1914 very easily. There's no corroborating period documentation of a motorized drive, and as it survives, the work could not have been satisfactorily driven. Indeed, it would have been a work of auto-destructive art. If you could find a motor, and that's a big if in 1914, that could propel this length of canvas with elements glued to it, what happens when you pass glued elements onto canvas over rollers? They will just flick off. Yeah? So that's not going to work. And what would the mechanical means be? Oh, we'll just put a motor on it. Well, what sort of motor? To propel that kind of weight, you would need an industrial scale motor. Because you couldn't use a clockwork motor, because quite simply, it wouldn't move it because of the weight. Oh, we'll use an electric motor. No, you won't, because there's no electric motors at that point. There's no three-phase electricity. You would actually have to use an industrial motor, probably using a fossil fuel, and it would be incredibly noisy. So if we run this by any form of motor, we're going to wreck it. First time out, we're going to destroy it. So that doesn't work. Yet, if what Grant's saying is, oh, it's accompanied by gramophone records, that applies a domestic setting. You can't have the motor and the domestic setting, at least not with the canvas on this scale. Could we even have found electricity for the light bulb to illuminate the window? Yes, up to a point, because only 2% of British households in 1914 had electricals, mains electric supplies. They were, fortunately, the posh upper end who tended to collect Bloomsbury's art, but it's actually a real problem to actually find that. And as I say, you won't get an electric motor. There's no ring mains around the walls in houses at this point. And the final wrinkle on this is Grant left behind a sketch for a winding mechanism in 1914. Two problems. One, it runs the scroll vertically rather than horizontally. Secondly, and very conveniently, he actually includes the dimensions. And the spools are only 7 centimeters across. So it's a quarter of the size of this. So what are we to make of this? Is this drawing not related to the scroll? Did Grant have something else in mind to go on it? Watney says it's a winding mechanism for the scroll. Watney used to talk to Grant. But in that case, what was meant to go on, given this isn't going to fit? And that became the basis of our investigation. And what we tried to do was say, okay, starting from the winding mechanism, using 1914 technologies, where do we get to? And this is what I think actually I'm going to show the film now, so that'll give you a sense of how we went about it from the voiceover commentary. So let's go. That is there. There.
Many commentators writing about Duncan Grant's abstract kinetic collage think of it in terms of the early history of cinema related to abstract film, and think of it in terms of the modernist avant-garde's experiments with film. And perhaps Tate's own film version, made in 1974, contributes to that. But in fact, we maybe need to think of Grant's project as something that's inherently domestic. Grant was very familiar with making domestic objects. He and his partner Vanessa Bell made a number of curtains, carpets, and other designs for Roger Fry at the Omega. And this project examines the scroll in that context, and not as a part of the history of film, but rather as an amazing prototypical form of television. Grant left behind drawings of a winding device, which would never have carried the scroll as it survives in the Tate. But the scroll would have destroyed itself, the collage would have thrown off, the paint would have fragmented. Grant knew that to make the scroll into something that worked, it had to be light, it had to be small, it had to be able to be illumined by a weak light bulb positioned behind it. What we're looking at is Bloomsbury's version of television. Furthermore, Grant said in 1970 that he'd intended for it to be accompanied by gramophone records. In 1914, there was no electrical amplification. So, in fact, to hear anything on a gramophone, you had to be quite up close to it. Again, we're in an intimate domestic environment, and we're perhaps in an environment where The scroll isn't even powered, but is hand-wound. We've experimented throughout this project using only 1914 technologies to see the kind of problems that Grant would have faced in turning the scroll into something that was a replicable, usable device. And there are real issues when you start to play around that you discover, for example, that if Grant had used a clockwork winding mechanism, the noise from that clockwork mechanism reverberating in the case would have completely overpowered anything available from a gramophone.
So that's kind of where we ended up, working on the basic assumption of what's left in the Tate doesn't accord with either the available technology or the drawings that Grant left behind. Now, obviously that's quite difficult for some people to accept, but yeah, physically Grant could not have done what he wanted to do with what's left. We have to treat it as assume it as a prototype. So in many ways, the radical part of Grant's project was never really completely fulfilled. That it's radical enough to make an abstract painting, it's radical enough to conceive of it as moving, but he never got to make it move. But it's kind of completely kind of revolutionary. This is a revolutionary yet neglected work. And I think the very fact that it's conceived as domestic object, potentially, based on the scale of the winding mechanism, is such, rather than kind of artwork for gallery, is part of that. And Grant and Bell were incredibly familiar with making domestic objects, to the point where, okay, the Omega wanted to unite art and life, that kind of good old modernist imperative, and insist on the handmade against industrial production. But in many ways, they also allow for quite kind of experimental fields of painting and the redeployment of painting, let's say, away from canvas. So one of the things that Grant and Bell do is that they make a huge number of these studies for carpets and for rugs and stair carpets that were designed. There were designs, they weren't necessarily all made. They were in pattern books. Omega customers could then look at the pattern book and say, oh yes, I'll have that one, please. And it would be then taken away and properly drawn up and woven by and produced by one of the UK's major kind of carpet manufacturers, probably by Axminster. So these were quite expensive luxury objects. But there's an interesting part of the kinetic that comes along here when we start looking at the history of the scroll. Simon Watney, in his early work on the scroll, looks at a sketch that Grant makes on the front cover of a French modernist art magazine, Les Soirées de Paris, from March 1914. And he says, it's a sketch, it's a long kind of patterny thing. And what he says, it's an early design for the scroll. Actually, if you match it with the surviving patterns of Grant and Bell's designs, which are all in the Courtauld Institute, it's a design for one of the stair carpets. But the very fact that he makes that mistake is kind of important, because in a way, I would say this is where the kinetic kind of enters the question, and I think what Grant and Bell were really experimenting with here is the notion of the relationship of the body to the painting in space. What is this is kind of quite similar to the abstract paintings that Grant and Bell were starting to make 1913, 1914. What's the difference between one of those on the wall One of those is a stair carpet and one of those on a scroll. One static, but if you have a stair carpet or a long carpet, you've just got a painting that can be walked on. If you have, so it's one relationship of the body to the painting. If you have, with the scroll, a different relationship, the painting moves past you. So that, I think, is kind of what they're starting to tease out with these ideas and these experiments, that they're thinking about new ways of kinetic encounters between painterly form, body, and observation. So, and Grant gets onto this at a very early stage, and it also involves kind of wallpaper. This was where Alex Trott came into the project, because Grant was in Paris quite a bit through 1913, early 14. He was working on stage designs for the French director Jacques Copeau for a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, I want to say. But in that time, he went to lots of artists' studios. He'd go around. And there are two key things that I would suggest kind of relate to the scroll. One is that in February 1914, he goes to see Picasso. And he takes with him a set of rolls of old, antique 19th century wallpaper that he has found in a cupboard in his boarding house, because Picasso really liked working with this old wallpaper. Picasso didn't use it as a scroll. He tended to tear it up and use it in his collages, and we can actually trace in his papier collé of 1415 the way in which these kind of wallpapers get used. But you've got, again, the idea of the scroll unrolling the roll of wallpaper. Interestingly, Grant's already in January 1914 sketching out colour relationships in scrolls. We actually have a letter from Paris, from his residence in Paris, addressed to him in Paris from his bank in Britain, with a January date on, which he then writes on. He kind of sketches out this colour patterning on the back of. So before he goes to see Picasso, he's already got this idea of the development of forms and colour in space and time. So that's one aspect. And the second thing that I think is of interest, and I have no evidence whatsoever as to whether Grant attended this particular performance, and it's not strictly speaking a scroll that's in question, but it's a work that I strongly recommend you to look at. It's an illustrated poem. It's a collaboration between the poet, the modernist poet Blaise Cendrars, and the painter Sonia Delaunay-Terque, wife of Robert Delaunay. And it's a poem called La prose transsibérienne et de le petit Gérin de France. And it's a story of travel on the railway being utterly modernist. So there's this kind of long journey, this Gérin taking this long journey from Siberia to Paris on the railway. And it's illustrated by abstract swirls and blocks, very typical kind of Delaunay. And it exists as a long single strip. It's not a scroll that unfolds. It has to be kind of unfolded and pinned to the wall. But again, what happens in February 1914, there is a particularly significant performance of this where it is pinned to the wall. And the actress Lucy Willems, very small woman, starts by standing on a chair to read the poem at the top and finishes it by kneeling on the floor to read the last lines. Again, we've got a notion of kind of both the text now and Delaunay's designs unfolding in space, feeding into what Grant perhaps has already conceived of. So, those are some of the affinities, but I would suggest that we actually see some of Grant's ideas going back even further. And in a funny sort of way, This again is Grant being quasi-futurist. This is Grant's Bathing in the Serpentine, 1911. And the 7 figures are not different figures. This is one figure. So we are effectively looking at stages of movement evolving across the canvas. In a sense, we are trying to be kinetic within the single space. But we could compare, as it were, and I think it's worth thinking about this, the way that you have the kind of evolution of the 6 blocks of abstract shapes within each of the 17 kind of clusters on the scroll, and the way they develop against the way we have the development of the body going on in Bathing in the Serpentine. So, same forms, different patterning, moving across time. So, I think there is an impetus in Grant's work that comes from quite a long way back that feeds into what he's trying to do with the scroll. And what he does do is he's increasingly kind of pressuring nature into abstraction as he does it, as he kind of proceeds with this. So I think that, and perhaps also one of the other places where he actually with this is a painting that feeds into what becomes an important debate around 1910, 1911 in British modernism. This is the time of the second of Fry and Desmond McCarthy's post-impressionist shows, these are the 2 shows of 1910, 1911, or 1912 rather, that make a huge impact on British modernist painting. First real introduction of continental modernism to British eyes. And in the catalogue for the second, Fry, who up to that point has really kind of been very critical of Kandinsky and Kandinsky's ideas around visual music, comes up with his own notion of visual music, of the idea of the rhythmical kind of movement and repetition of forms in space. And one of the British painters who he sees doing it is Grant, precisely, in a painting like Bathing in the Serpentine. So, in a way, Grant is working over 3 or 4 years, I would suggest, towards a notion of visual music in the scroll, the kind of flow and patterning of abstract form in space, and then, as it were, decides to reinforce it by having actual music alongside. So yes, that's where we are with the project at the moment. An absolutely extraordinary and neglected and incredibly radical work of British modernism, and I think European modernism. It isn't really like any of the abstract paint. There are kind of few works around in European modernism that are clearly around notions of abstract film as early as by 1914. You've got in Italy as early as 1911, 1912, the Giannani Corradini brothers are experimenting by hand painting untreated film. They buy film without the photographic emulsion and they hand paint it. And they project that in spaces to the accompaniment of music. So you're kind of creating a colour-saturated atmosphere with a quartet playing within it. Kandinsky comes up with ideas for colour plays, where he has the yellow sound. And there's kind of the green, the kind of, I think he works through violet, 4 different colours. None of those are formed by 1914. That they're theorised in the Blaureiter. And finally in France, Léopold Sauvage in August 1914, not a good time, comes up with an idea for a proposal for a film that he makes to Gaumont of a wholly abstract colour film in which you would have kind of hand-painted, frame by frame, this kind of development of abstract patterns on the screen in colour. Nothing obviously comes of that. Grant didn't know of that, I think. He certainly didn't know of the Giannani Corradini project. But he's kind of following his own path of visual music that comes out of a modernist desire to actually understand the relationship of the mobile body to space. And he achieves it in the scroll, or gets halfway in the scroll. He achieves it in the most remarkable and original way. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Christopher, I'm assuming that you're going to entertain questions and
Oh,
comments.
yeah, no, I'm
and
just
stuff.
going to walk out. Yeah, any questions, please? Yeah. People think we're crazy for doing it. It's like, no, it's just a canvas and it was going to be projected, and like, yeah, obviously. So one of the things we discovered very rapidly in doing this project was that art historians know very little about technology.
But this seems like a very eccentric piece of work, yes? And
Scroll,
The
yes.
scroll,
Yeah.
And was it eccentric even in Duncan Grant's oeuvre? What did he go on to make? Was there anything related?
Grant and Bell, yeah, and this is kind of part of the issue. You know, Grant starts out as a figurative painter. He gets increasingly experimental, partly under the pressure of European modernism, but also, and you kind of see overtones of it in this, partly under the pressure of looking in kind of touring Italy and looking at, in southern Italy, looking at Byzantine mosaics and things like that. So it's encounters with kind of medieval and kind of late early Renaissance primitives. And then, yeah, seeing European modernism, going to Matisse's studio, seeing the dance, things like that. So that getting an encounter with European modernism, so but the abstract phase is incredibly short for both Grant and Bell.
Yeah.
It's about 18 months.
Yeah.
Probably over by 1915, when Grant does what's now called as his kind of in memoriam Rupert Brooke, which is again, not wholly abstract. It actually kind of takes its form from a Greek funeral stele, but it's read as an abstract painting, and there's nothing after that. After that, he goes back to figuration. And he doesn't get a lot of work made 1916 to 18 because he's conscientious objector to the First World War, and he and David Garnett are pressed into doing farm labouring. Mm-hmm. So there really isn't very much time to do painting. That's also when they moved to Charleston.
But the fact that he sort of dropped the ball with this thing, right? He does the painting, the collage, and he schemes up the mechanism, but he leaves it. He just leaves it. So in a sense, you know, you and the Tate are sort
We're
of...
completing it for him.
You are completing this work of art.
We're extrapolating what he could have done with it using 1914 tech.
It's a very unusual project, and I'm wondering, you know, what kind of place it might have in the canon of kinetic art and kinetic modernism, et cetera, since he himself dropped the ball.
Yeah, and there are reasons why, and I think one of the, numbers of key reasons. One, by 1915-16, there's the whole issue of the war. So it's like, actually, he's far too preoccupied with he's not able to spend a lot of time painting. Secondly, I think there is a question of technologies that, in a way, he knew how he could it would have been relatively easy, given what he and Bell did with the carpets, working on gridded paper and transferring designs for industrial production, to actually take the scroll as a painting and reduce it onto something that you could then do a print onto silk or very light paper, and effectively, you know, we could do that rather. We hand painted that scroll, but it would be very easy to do it as a printing exercise. So there's that question. The big question for me is, how do you drive the thing? Because as I kind of hinted in the commentary to the film, we tried all sorts of ways of powering this, and the only clearly, if you're going to have a winding mechanism and you're going to illuminate it, you've got to have a case. So we built a case, which in kind of the simplest way possible, and then decorated it Bloomsbury style. But if you put a clockwork, what we then did was we took a clockwork motor out of an early, well, sort of 1914-ish gramophone. So early 20th century clockwork winding mechanism that you can wind up. It's quite difficult to actually then create a gearing mechanism between that and the drive shaft at the bottom of the winding mechanism. And the noise is incredible. The case acts as an echo chamber, so you can't hear the gramophone. It's like there's a machine gun in the room. And so I've been kind of looking at different ways of how you actually damp that motor and how you fix it to the frame and then drive it. But I'm not sure it's possible. And it may be that Grant looked at that and thought, I just can't do this.
But your solution in the film, anyways,
Oh
was
yeah,
to
well,
just
we have
wind
John's
it
hand
through,
winding
right?
it, and that's kind of my original theory was that when I first wrote about this, when I was working on this at Henry Moore, was that because they're so interested in embodiment, you know, these people of Bloomsbury, they're interested in bodies. It's kind of like the whole thing around the carpets, everything about the interior in Bloomsbury is around bodily relation to space. It's a very corporeal culture. Why would you have something that you could just sit back? And it's like, whereas actually it could kind of easily be hand wound, and yeah, you know, you could get your butler to wind it if you couldn't do it yourself. Since Bloomsbury is an avant-garde with servants, it would be perfectly possible. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
what a historical footnote to the Speedo swimsuit.
Oh yeah, indeed.
Designed by a fish used as a fig leaf.
Yeah.
Could the canvas have been inside of a rotor?
It wouldn't. You just couldn't drive it. 18 feet, you know, 14 square feet of canvas with paint on and everything else is too heavy for anything but an industrial motor.
But if it was on the inside of a centrifugal
Yeah, you'd still have to find something to drive it.
rotation.
Yeah, you still have. No, we looked at it and it's like, the thing is so heavy, particularly if you have vertical rollers. Getting those into alignment, keeping them into alignment, it's going to strip its bearings. It's, from an engineering point of view, it's really, really difficult to do. So in a way, having a vertical winding mechanism is a neat solution. Having a vertical winding mechanism for something that's clearly a quarter of the size is a neat solution, because you know you can scale down, but its drive is still an issue. And it maybe is just around noise as much as anything else. Because, you know, there's no amplification, there's no electrical amplification before 1919 on gramophones. You're just not going to hear it on a, you know, if you just, all you've got is a horn gramophone, you won't hear a thing. So it's kind of full of technical problems. Yes.
It's such an interesting consideration of your suggestion of the scale and going into the first television. Like this bringing into the domestic, I think, is really important. And I think this idea of the quarter scale, and that in many ways that this larger object seems like it was a prototype for something else.
Completely.
And but I can't help but think about La Prose and how Delaunay's painting demanded this very specific, like you had to climb the ladder and then at the bottom go down.
And it is an absolutely physical thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of, in that almost as much as kind of the length of the paper is what, if Grant had seen that or heard about it, that's what he would have taken away from him.
Yeah. I know his work is he's just after 1914.
He's in Paris at the time when the Lucie Williams performance takes place.
Okay.
He is actually in Paris working with Coppel at that point, we know from his diaries.
Yeah.
We have no suggestion that he knew anybody in Morphist circles. He didn't, you know, he knew Picasso through Gertrude Stein.
Yeah.
But we can't find any trace of reference ever to the Delaunays or Sandra or any of that group. But he could have been there.
Yeah.
And the other mistake that people make is to talk about the prose as a scroll, and it's not. There's a central fold that means you actually have to have the whole thing unfolded in one go. It doesn't unravel.
I guess this is incredibly fascinating. Like thinking about the parallels and simultaneities of like Nous descendons un escalier, for example, in reference to this. Like thinking about something happened in 1912 that it in many ways is kind of things happening all together at the same time, both within the canvases and in the world.
Yes,
is quite a unique moment. But I think the big thing for me is about this bringing into the domestic, because with the La Prose, it was about an action that took place in a public space.
Yeah.
Whereas this bringing this into the home and then limiting the movement of the body. Like if we are going to say that Bloom's story is all about the body and space, it actually is about being able to maintain one's position, not assume a new one.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a class thing that's really worth considering here. I mean, you've brought it up often.
Yeah.
Like the avant-garde with servants is such a great catchphrase. But then thinking about how you go from watching someone go up and down, like literally this massive amount of space, and watching a body contort for you to read this out, as opposed to driving something well-seated in a luxurious environment. And then, of course, the war interferes. Like there's a shift from the private to the public that happens there in a very demanding and traumatic way.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
But you're not sure he actually intended this for a domestic space.
We're having to extrapolate.
You're extrapolating from his wanting to use the gramophone, etc. So that seems kind of tenuous to me.
Well, no. The key thing is the scale of the winding mechanism. The moment you get to a winding mechanism that is a quarter of the scale of what's left of the actual scroll that survives, it's like, well, what are you going to put on there? The moment you put it on there, you've got this thin, fragile strip of paper or silk or whatever that you can illumine, which you can't do with a big bit of canvas, which you can propel in one way or another, so it kind of fits all of those aspirations. And you can hear with a 1914 gramophone. But the only space it fits is domestic space.
The gramophone itself is the pin in that.
Utterly domestic object.
It has to be that. And don't forget, this is a time of great. Like they're inventing ways to send concerts over telephone lines in New York City at this time. Like the idea of getting sound to the public in concert with image movement is action. It's happening in big ways. And silent movies were not silent; they were accompanied by speaking, by
actors or by live musicians or whatever.
As well as by the participation of the audience.
Yes. But and part of it also is, in a sense, the negatives. That if you say, right, we're going to take the scroll as we've got it and ignore the winding mechanism, it's actually a work of auto-destructive art the moment you try and propel it. So,
It's fascinating.
But he was alive when the work was accessioned.
He was in his late 70s. He was in his late 70s. He was Vanessa Bell had died in 69, 69. And he lived until 78. And it was quite funny. He met Simon Watney. He met Simon at a party in Brighton, and said, "Why don't you come and kind of sort out my paintings for me? come up and see my scrolls." And Simon described it to me that he was in the loft and he came up with this, and he said, "Duncan, what on earth is this?" And he said, "Oh, that's something I experimented with before the war," not meaning the second one. And Simon just said, "I just rolled it out on the grass at Charleston and started looking at this thing." He got straight on the phone to Richard Shone, who was the only art historian in Britain who was interested in the Bloomsbury group at that time. And Simon's like, 19 years old. It's like, what am I going to do with this? The Tate buys it just almost immediately.
And Grant is wanting the Tate to realize the project as he
realize it. I think the problem is that as I say, I think that David Brown in particular, the Tate curator, they take all of those discourses of the time, around formalism, particularly around notions of abstract film as they're being formulated in kind of avant-garde film theory in the mid to late 70s, and impose them on it. And Grant kind of goes along with that.
But you're saying that was really a misreading of the
Yeah,
work.
and I'm thinking that's kind of, it's a really good example. I've had discussions on this because the Tate actually is doing this with a number of its works in its collection now, to look at the way, in fact, in which the kind of discourses determined the reading of the work and closed it down at the time of accession. So it's being, Tate Gallery is now much more careful about trying to kind of apprise themselves of what they've actually got in a work, rather than saying, it's this. So it's been actually quite productive having that debate with contemporary, curators and people at Tate now around actually trying to kind of look at the way in which they actually misunderstood and closed down works.
Mm-hmm.
It's very interesting.
It's really important from an andragogical position to acknowledge that refusing of presentist reception, and to not sort of erase all of this contextual information that it goes well beyond suggestions. Like, it's easy to make alliances of formal decisions with experimental film at this time, but it's so important that you've brought it into this other understanding.
Yeah. And our point would be that those kind of the reading that the Tate made in the 1970s completely ignores the technological limitations available to Grant in 1914. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Terrific. It's just so funny to see that mechanism.
Yeah, with James having to wind it. Yeah. James, he was actually the guy who built the Palace. He's actually a theatre prop designer. Most of his good work on resident he helped build the case and create the wedding case.
It's a shame that they don't have access to the carnival ride.
And
The motor carnival.
yeah.
You put the canvas inside.
No, one of those dioramas. Well, there are those things exist, because there were but no, even before then, there were moving dioramas in the 1870s.
Like zone trips.
Yeah, but they're actually a huge diorama, big walk-around dioramas. Because the histories of these people have got history paintings where they're on rollers, and they've actually got people behind them doing the rolling. So, but it's not like the canvas moves as a scroll. It's like actually, it's moving on very big gradients. So it doesn't stress the canvas.
I want to see the canvas recreated.
Do that.
The image that was reproduced.
Yeah.
I understand.